Millions of despairing men, women, and little children, victims of a system that makes men torture and imprison innocent people.
You cannot shake hands with a clenched fist.
Produced by a nuclear exchange would be carried by wind and water and soil and seed to the far corners of
the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
We're not saying that planet Earth is coming to an end. We're saying that planet Earth is about to be refurbished, spaded under, and have another chance to serve as a garden for another civilization.
Most of the people in here are just your reflections. They're your mistakes.
1776 will commence again if you try to take our firearms.
1 million of the planet's 8 million species are threatened.
You are what you repeatedly do. Therefore, excellence ought to be a habit, not an act.
Your lives and the credibility of the United Nations is at stake.
Epstein didn't kill himself.
The reason this is such an interesting time is not only because we're on the threshold of the end of this civilization.
They're trying to take you out with bullshit.
The experience of the past 2 years has proven beyond doubt that no nation can appease the Nazis.
To those who can hear me, I say, do not despair. The misery that is now upon us is but the passing of greed, the bitterness of men who fear the way of human progress. The hate of men will pass, and dictators die, and the power they took from the people will return to the people. And so long as men die, liberty will never perish.
In the language of the U.S. Department of Defense, these are unidentified aerial phenomena.
Roswell's a very interesting place with a lot of people that would like to know what's going on.
There is very compelling evidence that we may not be alone.
This is the Garden of Doom.
Welcome into the Garden. And this episode, we're bringing back one of our favorite guests. He's been on Garden of Doom and Garden Views. It's Mike Hilliard from the Red Line podcast, which within the magnetosphere is the premier geopolitical podcast that there is. I'm sure you can find it where all podcasts can be found, but I find it on Apple. And as he likes to say about his guests, we're thrilled to have you on the program.
You're far too kind to me every time.
Yeah. I'm truly thrilled and joyous. I have some guests that I just don't understand how I got them and how I kept them. It's amazing. Anyway, that's not what the audience wants to hear about. So what are we going to talk about today? So, this show and its sister show have looked into the laws of space, and we've looked into geopolitics, and we've looked into all sorts of wild stuff. And Mike is an expert on geopolitical issues. Obviously, a lot of historical training comes with that, and with that comes some ability for foresight, and he has connections knowing what's going on in the world now that the rest of us might not. Certainly I don't. And what we're going to talk about today is warfare in space. So I guess we'll touch on what are the laws, what are the treaties, what are the norms, because they're not necessarily the same thing. What have been the threats? What are the threats, and what might the threats be in the near term, or as we can pull from sci-fi movies, the event horizon? So Mike, please tell us about Battlefield Earth or Battlefield Low Earth Orbit, Star Wars. I think I will stop with my metaphors of movies for the moment. But yeah, what's going on? What is the state?
We'll just space puns in by the end of this. Don't worry.
Yeah. Okay. I won't stop then. I'll just try and do better with them.
Yes, it's an incredibly fascinating area of the world, I guess, because it's so unprecedented. There's almost everyone's kind of working on the fact that we're going to almost use the laws of the sea to determine how things happen out there. But it's also so out of the usual and a completely different set of cards. That we don't really know how what's going to happen, how it plays out, what happens if X and Y, and how that ricochets out. It's one of these questions of, using an anti-satellite missile to blow up a missile that causes a tremendous breach and take it out of the satellites. What's the legal ramifications there? But even attacking another satellite is really dicey on who owns what, and it's private. Is it someone like Musk who puts stuff up there, or is it the United States that technically has jurisdiction up there? It is a really, really complicated legal world, but also militarily increasingly complicated, because now you've You've got satellites that are designed for ground attack. You've got satellites that are designed to attack other satellites. You've got satellites that are just purely communications. Others who are designed to encrypt stuff. You've got otherwise satellites that are just designed for surveillance. We feel comfortable that we can shoot down, let's say U-2 over Russia. We did that during the Cold War. But are you allowed to shoot down a satellite? If that satellite's watching your rocket bases or whatever it is, it gets dicey. We shoot down balloons, but if the balloon was a little bit higher into space, then technically we're not allowed to shoot it down anymore.
Right.
It's a really, really, the line hasn't been drawn, and I think it's just feeling it out now because everything is unfolding so quickly.
Yeah, my understanding is that there's basically the law of outer space says that all nations have agreed to use space for peaceful purposes or non-military purposes. I think that the language it's more or less identical to the Antarctica Treaty. But I'm not sure that everybody signed onto it, and then there have been a bunch of other treaties since then that not everyone signed onto, and in fact, some countries pulled out of. Recently Saudi Arabia pulled out of a treaty on not mining celestial bodies, which is a little bit strange because Saudi Arabia doesn't have a space program. However, if anybody knows how to extract things out of the ground, they certainly have the equipment, and maybe they're seeing in the future that the fossil fuels are going the way of the dodo and they need to repurpose, thousands of square miles of piping and drills and cranes and whatever other equipment they have they got to put it somewhere. I don't know, but there's been other things too. There was something recently that there was supposed to be some agreement on the moon, and I remember Professor Hanlon, who was on the show, expressed disappointment that they couldn't come to an agreement. I commented in her LinkedIn post, I goes, "You remember I was skeptical?" And yeah, she goes, "Yeah, I remember." So unfortunately, skepticism seems to be at least prudential, if not providential. So what do you think the biggest threats are, and who are the players? I imagine they're obvious who the players are, but maybe not so much.
So your big ones are obviously the United States. They're absolutely huge in the space. They've been the big player, and they are far above the others, sort of the second and third place for most things. Obviously, rockets, the Russians do really, really well. Russians have also just opened up their new Vostochny cosmodrome out in Vladivostok. That's going to be quite big for them. The Chinese are increasingly getting bigger and bigger into this. But then there's kind of this mid-tier of France and even guys like India and the UAE, so United Arab Emirates, who are getting into space as well. And that gets really dicey again, because right now, whilst, for instance, the US, Russia, and China have been pretty reasonable about what they shoot down up there, India just tested an anti-satellite missile and blew up and caused a whole bunch of debris, which is really problematic. Because everything's flying around so quickly up there, let's say you explode a satellite into 10,000 pieces. These pieces are, let's say, only the size of a thumbnail. But they're flying around at such a speed that when they hit something, it just rip it apart. And again, nothing up there is made of tank shells. It's all light alloys and equipment. And if that hits it, and that second thing it's into another 10,000 pieces, you can form a problem where effectively everything starts snowballing, and you end up putting so much trash and danger out there that it gets really difficult to get out to war, because the last thing you want is you put a satellite up there to get a new cable news channel, and then all of a sudden that gets hit by just debris that's running around. And again, the only thing stopping everyone testing anti-satellite missiles, because they're not crazy hard technology, is just kind of a gentleman's agreement in geopolitics at the moment. And that's a really one thing you're starting to see. These middle powers particularly getting this technology, and do they want to use it? Will they use it, and how will they respond to that?
Right. And I know this world is full of conspiracy theories, and now we're going to go into one that's outside of this world. But if the Russians did the same thing a few years ago. They blew up one of their own satellites, and it caused a whole lot of havoc. And so up until that moment, if any sort of space debris hit another satellite or another vessel, it's a pretty good chance it came from that Russian satellite. But if you want to say that the Indians and the Russians were in cahoots, well, now the Indians did the same thing. And now if the debris comes, imagine prosecuting that legal case. You couldn't prove who did it. You couldn't prove which state was liable, even if they were willing to subject themselves to the laws of Earth. and my understanding is that most satellites, if not all, are in 22,000 feet. That's low Earth orbit. There's probably some other things that are in orbit. I think like the International Space Station might be at 24,000 miles, not feet. And, who knows if there's anything else out there. I'm sure there's people that are yelling at me right now. The Black Knight satellite, the base is on the moon. We'll talk about that on other shows with other folks, I'm sure. But we'll just stick to what we know and can verify here. But I think it's 22,000 miles and 24,000 miles is, anything else is a vessel that's, going out, Voyager, entering the Oort cloud or whatever.
There's a high Earth orbit as well. So that's where you do, geostationary orbit rather than geosynchronous. And it's very early in the morning over here. So when it comes to, for instance, surveillance, there are two types of surveillance satellites. So one that is effectively going around the Earth all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Now that will, be looking at it 1 minute and looking at Norway the next. But there's also a different one, once you put it in a much higher orbit, which will follow the same part of Earth as the Earth rotates. So effectively, you would park it over a Chinese naval base, and you would just have it watch that Chinese naval base 24 hours a day. That's way above a completely different orbit, used for completely different purposes. But there's different levels of orbit, what you can put in there, and what they actually can achieve by being in that orbit. It's really interesting in that question as well, of like how many satellites do you want to use for just watching a particular naval base, and what do you want the flexibility of, you can see lots of things and go right around the Earth. Because some bits are, you want to be watching that all the time. Others are, hey, we want something that I could use to look at Tajikistan, and then tomorrow I could probably use to look at Saudi Arabia. It's a question of resources and availability.
And angles. I mean, it's not even like you have to drive somewhere. It's just you can half a degree. You could see another, whatever the equivalent is in math, 700 miles, 1,000 miles. I don't know. But there's no agreement as to where the atmosphere ends. And as you were pointing out earlier, the little pieces of debris, they move very fast. I mean, so I think everyone knows that the Earth rotates at a rate of 1,000 miles an hour, 24 hours, 24,000 miles is roughly the circumference of the Earth. It's not exactly that. Leap year, there you go. But the Earth moves in its orbit. I believe it's like 60,000 miles an hour is how fast we're hurtling in our elliptical. And these objects are in orbit with us. So they're also moving at 60,000 miles or so. A dime moving at 60,000 miles an hour is, might as well be a uranium bullet, launched at something. So the destructive power is incomprehensible, compared to the size. And I'm not sure anyone really gave this much thought way back when. Maybe they did, but there was a show. It might still exist. I think it's on Netflix called Space Force. It's not particularly good, but But they had an episode where a Chinese ship went up to a U.S. satellite and it deployed basically a giant scissor and cut the satellite in half or something like that. And it was funny until I read some articles that's actually some of the real technology that in some cases, like a French company was thinking about how to clean up space debris, and their idea was to have a ship with a giant net. Well, that giant net could pick up space debris. It could also pick up satellites. It could take your satellite out of orbit, maybe more than one, or maybe several Starlink satellites, So these are all multi-use things. It's, and non-military, well, does that mean all weapons? Well, police aren't military. We have a Coast Guard. So wouldn't there be a Space Guard too? And wouldn't they have some sort of weapon? Is that military or is that to enforce the peace? I guess it depends who you're asking.
Very much so. Again, what is military and what is not is a big question. Because I would, if a satellite is just sitting there watching a Chinese naval base, is that a military satellite? Yeah. I would argue yes, it is.
Mm-hmm.
But I would argue that the Ukrainian soldiers right now are using Starlink and satellites to effectively do the communications. That's powering their comm systems. Okay, is that a military use? Because if you get rid of that, then you're losing a whole bunch of civilian infrastructure as well, and that gets really dicey. A lot of missiles have to kill it will use GPS to help them get into position. Is that a military asset then? Again, this is where the line gets really, really weird and when it comes to the sort of the scissors thing in Space Force, it's not quite there, but it's not far off. Effectively, if you're trying to get rid of your enemy satellite, there is a lot of satellite-to-satellite capabilities. There's effectively two ways you can do it. One is just literally extending a robot arm and throwing the other satellite back towards Earth. And that sounds crazy, but you don't need to nudge it very much. And once it heads back towards Earth, it's just going to burn up. Now, obviously, it's always falling technically when it's in orbit, it's a thing. But when you're actually, if you knock it off, then you can burn it up. I mean, the other option is lasers. People think of Star Wars like, but it's not that. Effectively, all you need to do is scramble its receiver or just melt just the chip or just a few bits and pieces, and the entire satellite becomes useless. Because no one's going to go up there and fix it, because it's just far too expensive. So satellite-to-satellite warfare is the most, it feels so underwhelming that the biggest weapons are, a little robot arm that can throw you out, or just a little laser that you can aim and just knock out the actual receiver. Because again, it's just, imagine just cutting the cord to someone's phone, and then, okay, now it's useless.
Well, sure, but we're in the infancy of space travel period. I mean, if this was, 5,000 years ago, and the advancing Navy had one sail, if you had something that could put a hole in the sail big enough, they no longer get enough wind. If they're reed canoes and you can put a hole in the canoes and in the bottom, they're sinking. I mean, so, it's the same thing. It's pretty easy. And the reason that they pick these distances for geosynchronous orbit is because if they're significantly below that, I mean, I'm sure there's other reasons, but I don't know whether it's 21,000 miles or it's 17,000 miles, but at some point lower, you're not just tied to the Earth's gravity. The Earth's gravity is pulling you in, and you burn up in the atmosphere. I don't know where that is and how far 22,000 miles is away from that. But as you said, if you just push down and it moves at its own pace, down there, it only has one way to go.
Yeah, and obviously you can try and just fling it out into the nothingness of space as well. There's lots of things you can do, but space is a really odd difference to fighting, let's say, on the sea, fighting the trenches of Ukraine. Effectively, because the economics of getting things up there is so expensive. For every pound you put up there is way more expensive. It's what makes mining up there almost a non-starter at the moment. So you have these satellites that you can make them so they can never be touched by another satellite. They're nice and laser proof, and everyone thinks they're all great. But now you've just tripled the actual equipment you have to put on it.
Right.
That's really expensive, and now you just sell 20 satellites for the cost of making one big fortified one that had to work in a network anyway. So it didn't matter because they're going to throw the cheap ones down and break your network regardless. So this is a really, really interesting sort of kettle of fish of economics, how putting lots of cheap satellites out there versus state-of-the-art ones, and what you expect to lose in opening combat. It's a bit rambling because it's a bit early in the morning here, but now the sort of question becomes, what does a day one conflict like? If let's say Russia and the United States were to, God forbid, go to war with each other, does Russia open this by just blowing up a bunch of US satellites and just causing absolute debris in that orbit, which, yeah, holy mother of God, that takes out banking systems, that takes out communication systems, that wrecks GPS, that just throws a bunch of everything off and becomes absolute chaos for a while. And even if the conflict can last 2 days and we end up having a peaceful resolution and people say, "Oh, my bad, sorry, I misread a text message or something," completely wrecks space for a long time. This is a real conundrum that we are worried that if we don't have the capabilities to defend satellites, we don't have capabilities up there to fight back if someone's going to attack us on day one, we may lose it all, and that really helps your opponent. But at the same time, the more we militarize it, the more the other side's going to militarize it, and we are, A, taking money away from civilian assets in space, which we probably should be spending more money on, and B, increasing the war not only wrecks things down here on Earth, but also wrecks space for a much longer time. And the sort of the net that the French are talking about, or particularly the Japanese, who are looking at laser weapons to try and just burn, just push little bits of debris back into effectively burn up in the atmosphere. great, but A, requires an absolute load of energy to get through the atmosphere, which is a pain, because you're still shooting it from effectively on the ground. And B, we don't know where every little bit of debris is. We can track most of them, but there are going to be little flecks.
Right.
We miss one and accidentally hit something, and we start the whole chain again. And it's one of those, we could spend 2 years cleaning this up and miss one, the tiny little top of a nail head, and we start the whole process again. And that's, economically a problem again. So there's a whole bunch of different problems with space that we are not ready for, whether it be day one or trash or how much we militarize this particular theater.
Right. But they're always making new things that are lighter and stronger. So there's new metals that are being made that are lighter and stronger. There's new plastics that are more durable. I'm sure they're doing the same thing with glass. But I don't know what materials they use on spacecraft, but I'm sure they're working on those. And whatever terrestrial uses they have, somebody's going to be smart enough to say, hey, we can basically make a Swiss Army knife satellite. I saw one of the real proposals was basically they would extend a crab claw, like a lobster pincer or whatever. But it probably doesn't need to be all that big. It just needs to cut one of those thin lines or impact the solar dishes that power the thing. I mean, if the satellite doesn't have any more power, and I believe all the power is generated by solar in a lot of those things, then it's just a useless hunk of junk anyway, even if it's not causing any damage. So I don't know if it's practical to stop it. Even if there was a space guard instead of a coast guard, first of all, where's their jurisdiction? Can they go all over around the Earth? Is it going to be an international force? I mean, it's probably going to be financed by us, meaning the U.S. You're in Australia, so you're not necessarily part of us.
Not technically, but yeah.
And that's important. Plausible deniability. But is everyone going to be so happy with us roaming around up there? No, they absolutely are not. And I've spoken to a lot of smart people who are planning on mining and space tourism and space commerce. I've also spoken to a lot of smart people who say, we're nowhere near that. We're not. Everybody who's talking to you about mining things in space, they don't know what they're talking about. My belief.
Where I would sit as well.
Yes, I heard. I in fact heard you say. My response to that is always, as soon as they find something that's valuable enough and rare enough, they'll find a way to make the dollars work, and someone will go up there.
Absolutely, of course, and that's the thing. Economically, we can do it, but economically, it just doesn't make sense. Let's say, people talk about these they find this big comet, they say, look, it's got $50 trillion worth of helium, and that they do that by they take the amount of helium or whatever it is inside that asteroid, and they just times it by the amount of that mineral we have on Earth,
right?
What the price per kilo is back here. But the trouble is that we need to get a rocket up there,
right,
which is always very expensive. Get out there, which is going to be a pain because obviously, it's flying at a very, very fast speed and you have to time it exactly. But even if we manage to do that and we get on there, we actually need to fill it up, which requires either a drill and everything getting up there, fill it back up there, and then take off again.
Right.
And then manage to get back to Earth, which is another pain, and then get back down. And even if we want to build, let's say, something to survive orbit and survive crashing to the Earth, because the last thing you want is that it just smacks into the ground and explodes the helium, all the helium you have just disappears. You need to build something that survives re-entry. So let's say, is all that worth, let's say, a ship, like let's say, something the size of the Soviet space shuttle worth of helium? No. That just economically doesn't make sense. You could fill it with all the helium you possibly could, but something that size doesn't make up for the cost of, effectively going out there mining and bringing it back. You can do it artificially in labs, or you can try and, there are a lot of these elements that are, we have them on Earth, but they're just in such tiny concentrations that you end up having to pay a lot of money to get, the end product of a kilo worth. So we're still a little bit off because the economics just don't make sense. But let's say if we have reusable rockets that are far better and far cheaper than what we currently have, and we can store a lot easier, and we can effectively have much larger amounts of sort of capacity to bring back to Earth, then the numbers change and maybe it is viable. But right now, you're looking at many billions of dollars to get, a couple of trucks worth of helium, which is just not worth it.
Right.
Great concept. It's in the future. It's not economically viable at the moment, which is so many sci-fi things at the moment. We're doing a piece on this week the economic viability of nuclear power, and it's like, yep, it completely works. We can do all of these crazy things, great science experiments, fusion, all these great stuff, and we can cheer about it. And then you ask the question, is it economically viable? It's going to be cheaper per megawatt hour than gas, and they go, well, no, it's not. You go, is it cheaper than renewables? Well, absolutely not. Renewables are way cheaper. And then you go, okay, well, why would the private sector invest in this if it's more expensive? And you go, well, that's the problem. That's where we're stuck. We're stuck at the science, experiment levels where it's possible, but not economically viable.
There's also the
space mining kind of fits in that same category as well.
Yeah, there's also the not in my backyard thing with nuclear as well.
NIMBYs are definitely part of that story as well. But it is, even if you could just run over the NIMBYs, it's not economically viable in certain places. Obviously, certain countries have different parameters for their economics. But yeah, it's a really odd conundrum that effectively we could, as a species, can do these amazing things until the accountant goes, no, that's not economically viable. That we can't mass produce that. And a lot of this is going to be the problem that, the reusable rockets, for instance, or rockets that can go out that far and do it and come back, are possibly, could be built. There's blueprints for it. We have the ideas. We know how to do it. But if you build one, that's horrifyingly expensive.
Right.
If you build 10,000 of them, actually the price comes down because you have a supply chain, you have people who do this. You get, it starts to build up an actual economy about it. But we're not have any use for 10,000 of these things at the moment. So effectively, we have to keep, waiting to a point where it becomes mass-produced, or the private industry gets involved, and much more than what they are, for the price thing dramatically drops. The same way that a laser printer was, 20, 30 years ago, absolutely just out of the realm for a home or a person to have, but then it became a mass-produced product because we bought enough of them, we got to economies of scale, and it became quite a cheap product.
Sure.
We need to get to that with space, and we're still a fair way off that one.
Same as everything else. I mean, space tourism right now is for the rich. 100 years ago, so was ocean travel. On the Titanic. Now, you can, pretty much anyone can afford a cruise if you want to. So yeah, economies of scale. I mean, that's the way it always is. I was told that there's an unlimited supply of helium-3 on the moon, or so they think, and the helium-3 could be used to create energy forever, except nobody knows how to make energy out of helium-3 yet.
So what they're referring to is part of nuclear fusion. And effectively, because helium-3 is used, you can effectively use you can use it to make tritium and then split it, and that causes a whole bunch of different problems with neutrons. Obviously, I'm not a nuclear physicist. I know the very basics of it, and mostly because I know the economics of it.
Right.
That you have to end up, it's doable, but you have to get a fusion reactor up there, and that's horrifyingly expensive. It also burns, particularly if you're going to run it safely, beryllium and a few other minerals, which we don't mine in large quantities either. So you'd have to get the reactor up there, and you'd have to build it, and you have to get the blanket around it to keep it safe from contaminating all the rest of your moon base before you can get the helium to power it. So again, if we can get it going, yes, we can power it infinitely from what we can find on the moon. That's great. That's the concept anyway. But we need to keep sending beryllium up there. We need to keep, pristine, hope to God it doesn't break down, because all the parts are horrifyingly heavy as well.
Right.
These things are the size of warehouses, and we're talking the problems of sending satellites which weigh, 3 or 4 kilos. They're not, so a lot of these satellites, particularly for, just connectivity or small surveillance satellites, aren't that big. And yet we're trying, now the discussion is going to, okay, can we put an entire fusion reactor on the moon? Which again, the whole other problem, because the heavier you are, the harder it's going to be to land that safely, and then also set it up and work with it and build it inside the moon. Because again, it's lighter to carry around, but you still got to have people to carry it and put it into place. And we're not going to have a forklift sitting on the moon very easily. So there's a whole bunch of problems that if we could solve, it's you solve that problem, you solve 10 problems after that, but then you now have new problems to solve.
Right.
But it's solving those initial ones, like how do you power things before you can start to think how do you get mining economic.
Right. What I'm hearing, though, is at least for the topic of this show, since we haven't solved those economic problems, there's actually less likely going to be competition for it right now, which is one of the causes of war, is scrambling for new resources. I mean, that's a big one. So we're back to a terrestrial war being fought in part or started in the stars. So, who has the ability? I mean, listen, there was the James Bond movie back around 1980, Moonraker. It's basically a redo of Thunderball. I doubt that even the mighty, evil, and noble country at the same time of Uzbekistan could launch a space base, and not for lack of trying. And I know that there's lots of people think there's already there's been a Nazi base on there for 75 years, and
I've seen that movie.
Me too. I've seen a couple of them actually, or maybe other bases. But again, sticking to the reality of it, like, who has the ability to put something up there in the air that could threaten, the satellites at whichever orbits exist these days, because they're all in orbit. Otherwise they're not a satellite. They're like Voyager. They're a probe.
So for which countries have the ability to effectively wreck low Earth orbit, it's terrifyingly most of them, because effectively most of your really good area denier missiles will get pretty near that area. And again, if you just want to shove it on a jet, go as high as you can with the jet, and then shoot it off and just get it to blow up and cause chaos up there, that's not actually out of the realm of a country like North Korea. That's possible. And that's a terrifying sort of, because the satellites and internet go down for North Korea, nothing changes for North Korea.
Right.
But it's, again, I don't think anyone would go down that road, because China would absolutely knock on and send a pretty nasty email to North Koreans if they were to do that. Again, knocking out satellites up there, unless you can just knock out your opponents. So, for instance, the Russians will use GPS system, not the US one. Some of them do, but a lot of them, they have their own Glasnost system. The Europeans have their own version of GPS they want to try and use. The Americans have GPS. Those are, what if I knock out my opponent's GPS version of that anyway? But keep my version. And that's maybe. But if you're just doing let's just explode things up there and cause a bunch of chaos, you can't just target your own satellites. The thing's going to go everywhere. You're going to take everyone out. So we're not. The terrifying thing is that there's a lot of other countries that have the capability to cause that chaos, because it is the price of rockets has gone down and the amount of things we can put in the air has gone up. But I don't think anyone's looking to do that. It hurts everybody dramatically for not really that much gain. Particularly if you're even a middle power who's being invaded. Let's say India and Pakistan are going to war with each other. They're not going to gain much from just blowing up everything GPS-wise. So, it's one of those, again, possible, but no one really has an incentive to do so.
And I guess also no one really has much incentive to build defensive measures. One, because there's an enormous amount of space out there. That's why it's called space. The other is it's expensive against the low risk, and the other is, I think a lot of countries are now gearing up for basically World War II style land wars because of what's going on in Ukraine. The U.S. and China are probably building more on naval and technical things because of the Pacific, and the Europeans, to the extent that they're doing anything, I assume that they are also working on defenses and looking east again. And those are those are probably the biggest militaries. I mean, the Saudis have all the money that they would need, but I don't know if they have the ability or desire to launch that kind of war.
So every military has a budget, and then all the armed forces will compete. Whether it be the Navy, the Army, the Air Force, they're all going to compete for that same pie of money. And yeah, you could put all your money into making a rinky-dink satellite that can see the back of someone's head or read someone's phone from space. Great work, but then you've just cost yourself probably all of the ammunition shells that you could have built for that same price. And again, a lot of countries don't have an incentive to go build this huge satellite or surveillance network because they can just piggyback off what the Americans have if they're in that sphere, or they can piggyback off what the Chinese have if the Chinese being polite with them. But also, just what do they really gain from if Pakistan or let's say India can see Pakistan's troops moving? Yeah, that's great. But what does Bhutan need to see India's troops moving? By the time India is going to invade them anyway, the war's done. They're not going to gain anything from getting news 14 minutes earlier that the Indians are coming. Not that it's going to happen, but just as a case example.
They'll start throat chanting earlier.
If all the US chiefs were to go to the president and say, you know what, screw tanks and UAVs and F-35s, we're going to give up on all our military programs. We're just going to do space stuff. We could do some amazing, amazing things, but we'd also have to give up everything else the US does.
Right.
It's pretty unlikely at this point.
Right. There'd be no more carriers. All those 40% of subs that aren't being repaired right now are being refitted are going to stay that way, and the other 60% will slowly go to disrepair, and those are more realistic threats for now. The thing that I think scared me the most, because you're right, if you blow up a satellite or just even knock it off its course in the orbit, it's going to collide into it's a domino effect. But if you just nudge it down or nudge it up, so it burns back into the Earth, or maybe better yet, it goes out into the reaches of space. I mean, maybe in 32,000 years, it'll, get to Andromeda or something, and they'll be mad at us. That seems to be something that you could do easily enough, but you'd have to have some sort of shuttle program. I mean, or you have to be building things that are remote control, almost like space drones with remote control, single function to get up there. And I don't know, I guess nudge a satellite out of the way. And then if you want to cover up the evidence, you just have it follow it and keep on going. Because, I don't think there's any Wawas or gas stations or ATMs up there with cameras.
Well, again, Russia, the Russians, the Chinese, and the Americans have that capability already. We've seen the Russians, can move their satellites about. They can, effectively, they have the capabilities to try and intercept messages between ground and satellites. They've been doing that for a while. The Chinese can too. But the Russians also have the capability to throw satellites off orbit or throw them back down toward Earth. That's great, but again, what's the real use out of it? Might throw one or two satellites, but then the US have the same capability. They just throw a few Russian satellites down. We really just get to the point we're just throwing these other satellites down to the ground.
Yeah.
Because again, it doesn't really. It's a very expensive operation that very quickly runs everyone's budgets down, and no one really gains that much from it. If you're, there's a couple of ones that you would really worry about. So, there's always been talk of the kinetic weapons being used up there, because effectively you can drop a very heavy rod or you can use. By the time it builds up enough kinetic energy, it hits the ground with effectively a force behind, will cause a Hiroshima-sized crater. There's also been a lot of talk of MIRVs being used up there. Now, it's not completely sure the Russians have stuff up there. I wouldn't be, because we're recording this, I wouldn't be confident to say anything, but I think we could all have a pretty good assumption of what they have up there. And that's terrifying for everyone, because right now, there's been always that kind of worry of, okay, if the Russians launch all their nuclear weapons, let's say Doomsday comes, they have a 90-minute run between 90 or it's 47, one of the two, it's very early, comes out of the tubes in central Russia or flying towards the White House, and you kind of have 90 minutes to get your stuff together and get in the bunker, or 45 or whatever it is. But if you're launching from space, you've got 90 seconds, and at that point, by the time NORAD sees the blinking light, doesn't matter. The president's not going to get the bunker in time.
Right, and that's not going to matter to you or me.
No, not to you. But it will absolutely, it will throw a lot of the playbooks out, because we have all these sort of procedures that we wrote during the Cold War of, okay, if nukes start flying, the president goes in, and we can still run, have command and control, and we can still kind of run the country from this bunker beneath the White House. But if the president gets hit in the first 30 seconds, then it kind of throws everything up, and we're down the chain, being probably the Secretary of Agriculture all of a sudden becomes the president. Again, these are way off scenarios from what we probably started the conversation with, but it's a really interesting addition to this, that there are offensive weapons up there.
Who else has offensive weapons up there? I mean, it can't just be Russia.
There's a debate if the Chinese do. I would be surprised if they haven't at least got the capabilities, or they haven't thought about it.
I would be surprised. What about the U.S.?
Yeah, we know the U.S. has some offensive weapons up there. But
so
again, if they're kinetic or nuclear, that's the debate you have up there.
Yeah, but it's still mutual assured destruction, which
that's the big thing.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to work well enough, I suppose, until it doesn't. But Anyway, no, Bob.
Look, it's saved us this far, and I think as much as mutually assured destruction, if I was to explain it to an alien, it would make no sense at all. It has both sides don't want to destroy each other. Like no one wants Russia to become craters, and no one wants the United States to become craters, and it makes the United States make that consideration of, I'm very sure the United States probably would have gone and taken the rest of Germany if they didn't think that it would also cost them most of the United States major cities. The same with Cuba. So it has probably prevented quite a lot of wars from kicking off and going down that road. And it's at least comforting to say, they're both communicating with each other, and they do actually make each other aware, and they do lead to de-escalation. So, classic example, one of the first people that the Biden administration called about when Biden was going to go visit Kiev were the Russians, pretty much to say, hey, look, Biden's going to go to this stop in Kiev. I know you're going to hate it, but Biden's going to do it. Do not bomb Kiev that day because we're going to be in Kiev, and I don't think you want to start World War III. And the Russians, they didn't do any airstrikes or any strikes for pretty much the 2 days either side. They don't want to start World War III over this.
Yeah, no, which is nice to.
In communication.
Yeah, and that's good to see, and it's a heck of a way to test it. But but it's good. Yeah, exactly. Okay, well, let's move on to my favorite country, Jeffzikistan, but Jeffzikistan Incorporated, and we have private actors. Maybe their name might resemble my Twitter handle backwards, which forwards is actually a real name. And, there are some private actors who have the ability to put things into space. And also one in particular that might have the incentive to destroy communication satellites because they've put up 60,000 of them. And now all of a sudden you have a monopoly on information around the world. And, I was having an argument with a friend of mine. I'll call it a discussion argument, whatever. And we just agreed to stop talking about it. But whether or not what Elon Musk did with the satellites, Starlink over Ukraine, was actually because he wanted peace or because he was pro-Russian. And I don't really want to have that debate with anyone else either. I tried to say, well, if you blockade one harbor and not the other side's harbor and you say it's for peace, that's taking sides. That's not for peace. You have to blockade everyone. Anyway, that's neither here nor there because, I don't really, but if somebody had an incentive in getting rid of all the communication satellites, private actor, and then they say, but I can replace it, and now I've already replaced it. I got 60,000 satellites up there. All you got to do is sign on to these terms and conditions here, and now you now control the world's information. So there's your Bond villain incentive. You don't even need Jeffzikistan for it. I guess Jeffzikistan is just where he's relocated all his assets for safe harbor. So we do need Jeffzikistan. For the safe harbor evil country. So, is there anyone that's doing defensive measures against something like that? Or is just like, no, there is no Jeffzikistan. Everything is in the United States or in another country that's going to police their businesses enough. Basically, the hooks theory with commerce, that nobody's going to go rogue in space because most of their assets, people, and investments are here on terra firma.
Yeah, and that's probably closer to what reality is now. To build a satellite that has satellite fighting capabilities is a very expensive operation to do. I don't see Elon Musk having the capital to want to go do that, because he's not going to gain very much by doing it. There are thousands of satellites out there that are doing similar jobs, whether it be just carrying news stations or whether it be, just backing up telephones, or whatever it is. And the moment he throws one down, maybe he calls it an accident. 2, 3, he's going to, have someone knock on his door and say, hey, what are you doing? Because the US will very much not appreciate that. Now, legally, it's a real question mark. And that's, we'll talk legal first, then we'll go back to what will likely happen in reality. So legal-wise, there isn't really a precedent for this because it gets, if you're attacking private property or attacking state property, who has jurisdiction? Are you going under international criminal law? Are you going by the law of the sea? Are you going by kind of the Antarctic Treaty? Everything is really up for debate, and there are lots of very dry lawyers who have debates in bars about this. and I've sat in a few of them. They are, amazing how weird they get down that road. But you get 3 or 4 satellites in before someone can start, seeing these things go down. You've got, let's call it X on the side of a satellite who's throwing stuff down. They're going to know who's probably responsible. They're going to call them because we know what's up there. The wonderful bit about low Earth orbit is if you're bigger than, let's say, the size of a fist, we know you're up there. Occasionally we get satellites get through us and we don't realize they've been launched, but because things get launched by rockets as well, we kind of get to see them when they're taking off. We know when they leave Earth. We know that when they enter orbit. We can track them pretty well. And when you see, hey, okay, satellite 2218, blah, 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 didn't appear this morning, and now this one didn't appear this morning, you can start to, okay, everyone be concentrating on this area because obviously there's something going on weird up there. So it would take throwing thousands of these things before he'd have a monopoly of communications. So that's one thing. In reality, the US would probably knock on his door and say, hey, knock it off, or we will just use our satellites and throw yours into space.
Right.
Or we'll simply just sanction you or do what we never do. And frankly, the US taxpayer is paying most of Elon's bills, or SpaceX's bill anyway.
That's true.
To cut that off, that gets, the US has a lot of nasty hammers they can use if it was to get down that road of, hey, we can absorb part of your company, we can give all of your competitors, effectively all your contracts, we can do a whole bunch of things, and really, really hurt SpaceX. So Elon has no incentive like the US government, particularly while they're paying West's bills, and no incentive to go pay millions and millions and millions of dollars to probably throw 1 or 2 satellites out there that would cost his competitors a fraction to replace compared to what he'd have to get, to have a satellite that moves, and they would target other satellites and get them down as well. So again, doable but not economically feasible, I think, is probably the theme of this entire conversation.
Okay, so I'm allowed to say this because I'm Jewish, but what about the Jewish space lasers?
Well, we didn't cover that one.
Okay.
We looked into it. We couldn't find anything on that one. But
okay.
It's what an interesting concept.
Licensed by Yahweh. So okay. Okay. So I guess the point is that we really shouldn't worry too much about it, and if it gets to the point near term, and by near term, I don't know what's near term, next 4 decades.
I'd say I'm not as worried about deliberate attacks. That's not what keeps me awake about space. It's an accident going wrong that keeps me up at night about this. It's someone decides, stupid down the chain of command, they're going to use an anti-satellite missile and doesn't account for the debris, or simply that someone makes a calculation wrong and accidentally launches, is trying for some mission to go, throwing a car out into space or whatever it is, and misses and hits sources of debris. Or there's a miscommunication on one of these satellites and they accidentally, use a kinetic weapon, by malfunction. That's something that does worry. Because again, it's not like a nuclear weapon where effectively it's got automators and it's got lots of safety catches and it won't, explode until it won't detonate the actual core of the weapon until it meets all these parameters. If it's just a kinetic weapon, you've just dropped it and it will just make it right over whatever the hell it hits. That's the stuff that worries me a little bit, that, we haven't really legislated, we haven't regulated, we haven't figured out all the kinks of what happens with that. Far more than, people making deliberately bad decisions, I guess is the best way to put it.
Is there any enhanced risk if there's actually a series of moon bases out there and somehow they can generate ships that take off from the moon and then hit the satellites, and instead of coming back to Earth, they fly back to their moon base? I mean, could there be a Star War out there and then it never gets into the Earth's orbit? It's always just outside?
I mean, it would be a worry because someone's got technology that's way above anything else. If someone has the technology to kind of go back and forth from the moon, and operate like that, it means that they are way above what we're all playing with at the moment, which would be terrifying. And if we all figure out, wake up one day and Belgium all of a sudden is just like, haha, I have this space program you didn't know about, and I've actually, cracked the ability to take off and land and keep going and do all that kind of stuff without, having to refuel a bunch of times. then yeah, that would be incredibly destabilizing for geopolitics, because they obviously have something that the rest of the world doesn't.
No, I'm definitely worried about Belgium. All the chocolate and the and all of the their wit stouts that they're making out there. It's a cover for something.
It's actually rocket fuel. That's where it is.
Exactly right. Okay, so we have to get a little bit into the UAP disclosure issue, because we're dealing with technology that we don't have, but, well, we've seen things that look like technology that we don't have. So if it's not extraterrestrial, which no one has said it is, and no one has said it's not, or some of it is, then it might be technology that we, whoever we is, some collective we here in the world, one of the 193 or so countries, does have. And does that change things at all, or do the pictures of Tic Tacs and whatever that you've seen, that the F-16s can barely keep up with, or can't keep up with at all, does that give you any pause or give you any other thing to think about?
Of course. Yeah, absolutely gives me pause, but yeah, we don't know enough to make definitive calls about any of this. That's the trouble. It is a lot of this is pilot testimony, or is like cameras, or it could be something on a camera, and we just don't quite know enough about it to make full calls. Now, if you look at sort of some of the people who were like, alien ship in sort of the early 70s, but it actually turned out to be something like a B-2 or a SR-71, which again, absolutely mind-boggling, scientific push. It was way above the parameters of what people thought was possible at the time. But only way above is probably the exaggeration I'm talking here, that it's from here to here.
Right.
Whereas, having some crazy ship that can go to Mars and back in a couple of minutes, whatever it is, that's a jump from here to way up here. So, every time there's something that's just, it's a lot quicker, or let's say it can do, hey, it can travel at Mach 32. Well, the Russians have talked about their new hypersonic being possibly capable of doing Mach 32. And that's debatable, the whole thing. That's been a lot of, about that road. But is it just a good bit of technology that's not publicly in the open source as of yet? That's possible. But there's also the possibility that this could be an aliens and could be whatever it is. We just don't know enough. And it's one of those, I've always been reading about this and listening to it, and I just don't feel confident saying one way or the other way.
Okay. So,
if I'm wrong, either way, pretty much, whatever I say.
Have you been following the different governments' UAP disclosures and hearings and things like that?
Yeah, I've been following it. A lot of it is a lot more mundane than you think it is. It's the classic example with balloons that, people, sort of freaking out over these balloons, saying that it seemed like it appeared one day, and all of a sudden, 1,000 balloons across the United States, everyone panicked. What the reality actually is that those balloons that the Chinese send over actually are fairly regular. They've been happening for years. No one's really cared about it because, they get what they're getting, but it's not the end of the world. It's something that the US can do with satellites. The Chinese just use balloons because they're much cheaper.
Right.
But because we all freaked out, they went shut it down. Everyone started looking into it, and you're going to find them because people are actually looking for them. And then they lowered the threshold of what counts, they're looking for, because effectively if it's above this size, then we'll actually care about it. Below this size, we don't. When you lower that threshold, you start picking up lots and lots of little things you didn't pick up before.
Right.
And a lot of what we're classifying as all these things that have come in are fairly normal things because we've lowered thresholds for what we want to pick up in the atmosphere and what we want to register and what we want to call and talk about. That's one factor of this conversation. From what they've disclosed, it seems like a lot of what they're talking about, like unidentified objects, are likely, surveillance equipment or civilian equipment gone, just all over the place. A lot of it will be that. But it's the 2% that we don't know what it is that's the really interesting part, and that's where that conversation is probably more where people are thinking about, where it could be aliens, it could be whatever, and it's just something that we don't know enough. I'm not staring at classified documents here on that one, so I don't know enough to define it one way or the other, but it is a very interesting conversation.
You were not a Mar-a-Lago, you were not able to see those documents.
They're all in the bathroom just sitting there.
Yeah, but one thing about Donald Trump is that if he actually found out evidence of UFOs or aliens, I don't think he could have kept it to himself. So if he didn't know, at least it's not the U.S. that's keeping anything at Area 51. But you talk to journalists, you talk to people at think tanks, people in the intelligence community, in the defense community, in various state departments and diplomats and all sorts of things. Is this a conversation that any of them are having other than for ha-has?
There are people who are having this conversation, but I think the week that all this came out was the week that Space Force was asking for a bunch of money. Mm-hmm. And they wanted a very high budget, and this put a lot of conversation onto space and what's capable in space, and took a lot of Midwest senators, I'm not going to call names, but made a lot of kind of people who were on that budgetary committee went, ooh, space is important, and helped them get their budget. If they were going to roll it out, it was going to be the budget week to do it. I'm usually a bit more cynical than the average person. I would imagine that probably had a big factor on why that came out when it did. Is it ground shattering? Really? It's if they're saying there's a good possibility that there are aliens out there. I mean, just statistically, anyone kind of probably assume there was anyway. It doesn't really affect our day to day. Not yet.
Can they make rocket fuel?
Keep my mind on.
Can they make rocket fuel out of corn and soybeans?
Look, if anyone's going to figure it out, it's the US going to figure out how to do that.
Yeah,
everything else out of corn. I was reading or listening to recently, and out of the corn that the US makes, only about 2% of it actually ends up as corn.
Right.
5% ends up as food, and the rest of it ends up as like plastics and fuels and ethanols and all sorts of weird stuff. And it's just, I don't know. That's another tangent, but just maybe through corn.
Yeah, and some of it is the farmers actually get paid not to sell it, not just to. I don't know what they do with it. Destroy it? I'm not sure. Who knows? All right. So I think we've covered war in space. There's a lot of there's potential for accidents, but doing something on purpose would probably be disastrous. And we're not really too worried about near-term laser battles in space anytime soon. And if we are invaded by aliens, there's probably nothing we can do about it anyway.
Probably, yeah.
So, was there anything that I should have asked you about, or something that you stumbled upon that you didn't have an opportunity to tell me that's on the subject?
I think the big one is about surveillance improvements, and this is where space is absolutely fascinating with what the US is able to do at the moment. So, effectively, there's a measurement that you talk about in space where it's kind of how much you can get out of a pixel, effectively. And Google Earth is going to have something like 50. That's the kind of number they're shooting at. 28 is a really good, you can see tanks and make out the individual kind of what tank it is on the ground. The declassified world is suggesting the US have got somewhere around the sort of 15-ish, but there's a lot of sort of stuff coming out now that they've got really down to some crazy levels that they can now read. Effectively, if someone was holding their phone like this, they could probably read the message on the phone from space.
Wow.
Which is an absolutely mind-boggling amount of surveillance. And again, the US will have very little amount of these because they're going to be so ridiculously expensive. But it just shows you the improvements in satellite and surveillance capabilities. And the other one the US is really proud of is effectively that they have satellites now that can launch, effectively beams and all sorts of stuff to measure and map out and form a 3D map of a bunker, which is an absolutely, when we had the piece that we did on this on satellites, surveillance, we had one of our guests who's ex-NORAD and ex-NASA, and everyone took us through how to do it, and effectively showed that they can shoot it at, let's say, a bunker from North Koreans and map out how many people are in that bunker, what the layout of it looks like, kind of make a 3D model of it, and then bring it back there, send that back to Washington, which is crazy that we can now do that with a satellite. We are at the point where we're able to see someone's bald spot from space quite comfortably.
That's embarrassing.
But it's that's if this is where we are, where do we go from here is the next question of that, and that's pretty impressive that we have that capability. So it shocked me what is actually possibly on the table with this.
What about?
I did not consider that the US government could possibly, if they wanted to, see me in my pajamas when I'm hanging out my laundry.
Okay, well that's interesting. What about like sound weapons or electromagnetic pulses. I mean, every movie we see EMPs, and that's sort of the indefensible thing for everything, though I don't see a lot of them being deployed, in Eurasia right now. Is that a thing, or is that a thing of science fiction?
Again, I haven't done too much work on EMPs in particular weapons. From what I remember, and it's very early in the morning, I'm sort of scratching the back of my head on this one. But to actually make an EMP charge go off and do the sort of distance that you really want, you're effectively going to detonate what's close to a nuclear weapon anyway.
Gotcha.
And at that point, you might as well just go for nuclear weapons.
All right.
They are really, really, they're detrimental, they're problematic. And again, what are you trying to do? You're just trying to blow up the semiconductors and everything. That's one thing. To do it would be more expensive than just to nuke.
Well, if you want to rob 3 casinos at the same time in Las Vegas,
that's different.
That's how you do it.
That would be, but yeah, and that's the other one is you could probably do, like the Ocean's 11 scenario, that you take out one building worth of it, and it's very expensive. Remember, the piece of equipment they steal in the movie is a scientific experiment, which again,
from Caltech
economics, they could possibly do it.
And of course, it worked.
It worked. That's great.
Right.
But do you really want to try and spend all this money to take out the lights in one Russian building?
Right.
And when you go to your Air Force commander and put that on the table and say, hey, I'm going to need X billion dollars so I can take out the power in one Russian building, they're going to go, A, we can nuke it, B, we can bomb it, and C, we know where the power station is down the road, let's just blow that up. And you go, oh yeah, why didn't I think of that?
Or 4, we can wait a little while, it'll probably break down on its own.
Very true. And again, I feel like I'm going to get tatted over my forehead. It's like, yeah, but economics.
You know what? That's okay. We all need a catchphrase. We all need a trademark, something that makes us us.
That's the best and most apt description I've ever heard of myself. I can't remember. I think it was some journalist called me. My personality is that of a depressed Excel spreadsheet. And I was like, that is the best personality, the best description I've ever heard of myself, and I will wear that with a badge of honor.
Oh, well, that's fine, but it's basically follow the money. I mean, it's and there's a reason that's a cliche, because it usually will take you to where you want to go, because that tends to be the motivation most of the time. All right. As always, you've been very generous with your time and knowledge. We're hit the 1 hour mark, so this is your time to sell yourself. I wanted to let everyone know I'm a Patreon of a show, so you should be too. But yeah, Mike, tell them where they can find you and support you, et cetera, et cetera.
So you can check out the Red Line on most of your major podcast platforms, as YouTube as well. We do big geopolitical deep dives, whether it be satellite surveillance or the economics of nuclear power, or the Libyan civil war, or the one we just did recently, or democracy in Central Asia. We do lots of big crash courses, with the aim being that after 90 minutes with experts from the White House and the CIA and academia and defense guys will take you through and effectively give you a big crash course on one big subject that you should feel that you have a pretty good understanding of what's going on in that situation by the time you leave there. That's on the major podcast platforms as well as on YouTube and all the other good stuff. But,
you up to 30 million downloads yet?
Yeah, I think we're just for I think we're 29 point something. So we're close. We're closing in on it, but I will be pretty happy once we hit that number.
Yeah, well, I think we're going to beat you. Okay. All right.
Again, you more than deserve it. It's a great show, and always happy to come on and chat to you.
Thank you so much. And when I think of something else that's wacky, I'll reach out to you, and I'm happy to know that you'll probably say yes. So everyone, Mike Hilliard, the Red Line Podcast. Subscribe to the show, tell other people, it's great, and if you have a few bucks to spare, become a Patreon as well, because that actually is how he pays him and his team. This is actually a self-funded thing, and they're doing it. All right, thanks so much for being on The Garden. I think this is going to be a Garden Views. While we got a little about outrageous, I think we're mostly stuck to real-world scenarios, so we'll keep this one in Garden Views as opposed to Garden of Doom. All right. Thanks again for being on the show, and as always, we'll keep in touch.
Thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure as always.
Thank you so much, Mr. Emperor. I gotta admit, I'm a huge fan. I've been following your work for a long time. You know, Death Star, Order 66, that was awesome.
God, leave us.
Oh, yeah, no, definitely. Let me just get like a quick pic or something. Like, I can get my phone out.